Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from www.englishwithkirsty.com. Here I'll be sharing with you tips, information and other learning resources so that you can improve your business English. Hello and welcome to episode 151 of the English with Kirsty podcast. I know we've already had episode 152 and that's possibly a bit confusing, but it was easier just to put out 152 first rather than pull everything down, re-edit, put it back up and confuse everyone. So that's why we have episode 151 now. So if you want to see the show notes for this episode and the examples, then you have to go to englishwithkirsty.com/podcast/episode 151. And this is going to be a fairly short episode because it's a short answer to a problem that came up in one of my lessons. One of my beginner learners had a problem and a question, and it was about how you deal with words that end with ed, because most of us learn that in the simple forms, in the way that we make verbs into the past tense form, usually if they're regular verbs we just add ed or a d if there's already an e there. But the question from my learner was, how do you know which ones give the ed its own syllable, like wanted or waited? You got this id sound at the end, and which ones do you just add your ed on and just make it a d sound, like worked or talked? And he said, well, I don't know. I look at them, and the mistake he was making was to always make this kind of ed sound on everything, which wasn't right. You don't say I cooked dinner, you say I cooked dinner. But then he was asking, well, there must be a rule, there must be a way to know how to do this, because otherwise you just have to guess. Do you really have to learn every single verb there is and whether it is a id sound or a d sound? That would take too long. And I didn't know the answer at first because we don't learn this at school. Generally, if you're a native speaker, that's not something you ever think about. And I thought, yeah, that is a bit annoying. There must be some kind of way to tell. The easiest thing I came up with, there are different explanations and some make it a lot more complicated than others, so I'm not going to do that today. But basically, if your verb has a t sound or a d sound at the end, we give it an extra syllable. So words like, so if you have the t sound, words like want becomes wanted, lift becomes lifted, wait becomes waited, start becomes started, coat becomes coated, flirt becomes flirted, and hate becomes hated. Even though it's a T sound, okay, the last letter in hate is an E, but it's still a T sound at the end of the word hate, so that becomes hated. And the same happens with verbs that end in a D sound. So offend becomes offended, need becomes needed, fade becomes faded. Even though we've got an E there, it's still the D sound at the end. Downgrade becomes downgraded, guide becomes guided, load becomes loaded. So in all of these examples you've got the id sound at the end. And with most other sounds, so we're not talking about the letters directly before the ed or the d, we're talking about the sound before the ed. With most others you just add like a d sound to the end of the word, but it doesn't get its own syllable and it doesn't have its own id sound. So like if we think about words with K, the letter K at the end. So talk becomes talked. It's not talked, it's talked. Like becomes liked, not liked, liked. Stroke, if you stroke a dog or an animal like that, stroked, not stroked, it's just stroked. And then if you look at a P sound, help becomes helped. It's not helped, it's helped. Stop becomes stopped. Escape becomes escaped. And just another one, an R sound. Pour becomes poured. Stir becomes stirred. And stare becomes stared. So We can go through lots of other letters in the alphabet like that, but the main two are the T and the D sound. And if you have a verb that ends with T or a D sound, then it gets its own ed, becomes its own syllable. Otherwise, it doesn't. Because the main problem my student was making was that he was making all of these sounds into an extra syllable, all of these words like walked instead of walked, that kind of thing, and that doesn't sound natural, and it almost sounds to a native speaker like you're saying a different word, and I'm trying to think what that word could be and then not listening to the rest of what you're saying. So it's important to get this right, because most native speakers don't really think about it. We just know what it should be because we've learned it. I don't ever remember learning this at school, so I don't think it was taught to us at school because it was new to me when I started thinking about it and looking it up. And so if you are ever wondering about the pronunciation, as I said, this was from a beginner lesson, but if you've ever wondered if there's a rule for this, now here is a rule, and you will find exceptions if you look for them, because that's always the way with rules. But a simple rule to work this out is see whether your verb has a T or a D sound at the end of it. And if it does, it probably needs an extra syllable for the ed. And if it doesn't, if it's any other letter, it probably doesn't. So I hope that helps. That was very specific this week, but I thought it was a specific question that I was asked, and I found an answer for it, and maybe that will help some other people too. Because English pronunciation can be really confusing sometimes because, okay, here we've got a clearly straightforward rule to follow, but often there are confusing rules about pronunciation, so the more things that you can find that do follow a pattern, then the easier it becomes. So I hope that's useful. If you have any questions about pronunciation or about English in general, you can use the contact form on the show notes page, which is englishwithkirsty.com/podcast/episode 151. Or alternatively, you can send an email to podcast@englishwithkirsty.com. Have a good week and have fun learning English. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes.